Hello and welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I'm your host, Julia McLeod. Please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of Treaty 6 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4, in which many Indigenous peoples have come before us to call home. We acknowledge the contributions that the Indigenous peoples have provided to help shape our past, present, and future. We commit to restoring and honoring the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and believe that together our collective communities can build a stronger understanding of all people who dwell on this land and who call it home. We are recording today from our beautiful new studios here at Lumen Christi, our common home in Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today's episode title is Well-Being and Self-Care in Education. The agenda for today's episode begins with our segment TSA, Tricky Situations in Assessment with Nicole Lafreniere, our Director of Curriculum and Assessment. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to difficult situations in assessment. Today's guest is Brett Barron, our phys ed and wellness consultant for secondary. Brett will speak to us about well-being and wellness and how we can consider ways in which we take care of our own selves as teachers and how we bring that into the classroom to support well-being for our students. Then we'll have our segment, We're Still Doing That, with Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack, where we'll explore outdated assessment practices and gain solutions to help us move forward. That's the plan for today. Let's jump right in. Assessment can be overwhelming for many teachers. When we think of student well-being, teacher well-being truly comes first. What advice do you have for teachers?
So when you're on an airplane and you're headed to Mexico or wherever it is that you're going, you're going to hear the flight attendant say that in the case of an emergency, put your own oxygen mask on first. And I think that that's something that we need to remember as teachers, because we can give and give and give until we're depleted. And we want to keep that love of teaching and of our students, and we want to keep that alive and well. One of the things that I think that we need to do as teachers in order to keep that alive is to constantly be learning ourselves, because that certainly for me, that fills my bucket. When I know that I can get better at something, when I'm working with colleagues in a way that makes my brain stretch a little bit, that can be both uncomfortable and exhilarating, because I know that I'm learning, and I know I'm being pushed a little bit in my thinking, and that means I'm going to be pushed a little bit in my practice. So one of the things that I would really challenge teachers to do is, as you're thinking about, for example, your professional growth plan for the year, don't think about your professional growth plan as being something that's so wildly separate from whatever your school is doing. So if your school has focused on whatever it is, let's say literacy, and we're going to be looking at reading data. Well, is there something in reading that makes you really excited about? And maybe reading data isn't it, but maybe it's about learning how to create a culture of reading in your classroom. Maybe it's around finding new and interesting novels that kids are going to be passionate about, so that you're dovetailing whatever the school focus is with something that you love. And because it's when you find that piece that is still really making you happy as a teacher, that you're going to find that you can continue to be well as a teacher. And knowing that there are boundaries that you can set as well. And that you can say, you know what, we're going to be doing this. We have to do this assessment and this assessment. Are there some things that maybe I don't need to do anymore? Maybe it was an assignment that you loved to do and it was so much fun, but it's just not fitting anymore in the schedule. And because it's not, you're finding that stressful. It's okay. That's okay. Let that one go and find other places where you can bring in that sense of passion. We have to keep ourselves well, because if we're not regulated, we can't help the kids regulate. And if the kids are dysregulated, no one's learning. So we really want to make sure that we are bringing our best selves, and that means filling our buckets as well.
To the show, Brett. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Great to be here.
A bit about yourself and your career so far.
Yeah, so I've been in the classroom for over 15 years. I've been in elementary, junior high, high school, and then I was lucky enough to become the consultant of phys ed, health and wellness here at Learning Services. I've taught overseas. I did that for a year after I graduated in 2007, and I came back to Edmonton Catholic. I grew up in Edmonton Catholic, so it was kind of a natural fit, as many people here do, come back to teach after going through their schooling careers. So it's been a great journey, and I think there's a lot that kind of goes into the desire to be a consultant, because certainly you want to work with teachers, you want to work with administrators, senior admin, but certainly just the desire and the passion to share the love of that subject area or discipline with your colleagues and the larger educational community. So for me, health, phys ed, wellness, those are huge passions of mine. And there's something that, even when I'm done at an office or in a building or in a school, like those things don't turn off. There's something that stay with me, 24/7. It's a part of who I am. So in terms of my interest in learning services, it would just be a matter of sharing those pieces with the larger community and really engaging, with people like yourself and doing podcasts or whatever it might be in terms of sharing it with the larger school communities.
So what we're going to try to do today with the episode is we're going to try to connect this idea of health and wellness and well-being for students to outcomes-based assessment. So there's a concept of mastery we talk to teachers about in outcomes-based assessment. So students are working towards mastery of these learning outcomes, and mastery fits into health and well-being as well. So
absolutely.
How does this concept of promoting mastery impact students' sense of self-efficacy and their confidence in their learning abilities?
That's a lot to unpack there, right?
Yeah.
So where should we begin, right? I mean, there's a piece of this whole understanding of what is wellness, and I think it's part and parcel the idea of what we know as schools as well, right? Because as schools, a lot of the time, I think we're very focused on curriculum, and that curriculum, or to be a good school or to be a good teacher, the mastery of the curriculum means that those grades are going to be here, and that our students' understanding of curriculum is also here. And I think when you bring in the topic of wellness, or at least traditionally, sometimes what happens with wellness is that it becomes this topic of just being an add-on, or this piece that just sort of is like, it's here for a day. We're having a wellness day, right? Rather than something that is unfolded and is a slow learning process and is something that we grow into. So I think right now we're situated in a really great spot where this paradigm is starting to slowly change, and we can even see those pieces emerge within the new curriculum. Having said that, sometimes the understanding of wellness is just really unclear, right? And that it's like, well, I have wellness in, maybe these 8 different dimensions, and I've got financial wellness, and I've got spiritual wellness, and I've got my physical wellness and my community wellness, right? So how do you get a handle of all those things, and to find somebody out there that has, all these great avenues of wellness, right? It's like, yes, I've hit all my pieces, and now I am the guru, right? Like, it just doesn't happen like that, right? And I think I think life is more complex than that, and it continually throws situations and circumstances that make us uncomfortable and challenge us. And I think the greater aspect of wellness is how we look at those situations and how we look at those circumstances and our paradigm and our understanding and how we view those as part of our greater understanding of life, right? And that the challenge that is brought to us is quite often the catalyst for improvement or the catalyst for leveling up. And so when we look at it, that even maybe some of the more difficult things that happen in our lives, in our student lives, are ultimately to our greatest benefit. That can be a really wonderful challenge, a very hard one sometimes to wrap our head around. But I think a wonderful challenge is something that I've certainly learned over the years, and there's been lots in my life too that I can attest to. So yeah, it's in terms of handling it from a level of self-efficacy, I would like to see the understanding that wellness is a daily part. It's a piece. It enhances instruction and curriculum rather than the single add-on or the one-off or the celebration day. So those pieces, when I mean they're large and they can be a little overwhelming, but once we can sort of integrate that wellness in curriculum, I think education at large will be in a much greater place to help serve not only the people, like, well, everyone within the building, not only just our students, but our staff, or anyone who comes into a school in itself, right? Will be able to sort of feel the growth rather than necessarily always the instructional demand. So yeah, again, I mean, I don't know if that answers all of your question or pieces of it, but for me personally, that's what I see, the great benefit of education, but also one of the great challenges as well.
Let's circle back to self-efficacy, talking about that second self-efficacy piece for students as a catalyst to their learning, a catalyst to those learning outcomes. Could you define what you understand to be self-efficacy?
Life's greatest challenge, right? I think the understanding. Well, let me kind of back that up. I think at some point, right? I think as a kid, if we look, I remember especially my days in elementary. I look at some of those kids in kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2, and they just believe they are the best. Right? Like, I am amazing. I can do this. I'm great at that. Right? And, I'm such a fast runner. I'm a great drawer. I can color the best, like whatever it might be. It's like, and if we could just capture that in a bottle and run with it. Right? But somewhere along the line, somebody says that you're not good enough. Right? Or you're not part of this group, or you can't do that, right? And so what happens is that we change our behavior to fit in with the group, right? So, and this begins our monumental journey of being human, right? And this journey sort of encompassing, what do I need to do to fit in, to be one of the group, right? And so I think a lot of the times what we do is we wear these masks, right? That I have to showcase or demonstrate my worth or do X, Y, and Z to feel the love, compassion, and empathy from others. And in order to do that, I have to wear this mask, right? And I think that, the whole piece with self-efficacy is that understanding and transcending that journey is the process of removing that mask and emplacing it with an aspect of self-love and care. And that can be a lifelong journey. to sort of transcend those walls and those, expectations, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about where the ego serves its purpose within that process as well, and its function within our relationships, because ultimately that mask that we wear, that is the layer that really prevents us from the intimacy and love that we as humans, as social creatures, that we need, right?
Mhm.
And that is really what is really truly and fulfilling within our lives. So in terms of an educational aspect, I think it's a slow process of understanding that each and every one of us has a lot to offer, not just something, but a lot, and that we need to make a lot of room for that growth and that self-care and that self-love, right? And I think, um, you know, as teachers, we can see that a lot within our kids, but how often do we apply that to ourselves as well, right? So it's a great journey, and I've had some absolutely wonderful conversations with colleagues, and it's something that really inspires me, and there's a real element of surrender that has to happen too, right? Because I think what happens a lot of the times is we go around trying to perfect our circumstances, right? And that is an exhausting way to live, because there's something that's always going to change, right? And there's something that's always going to happen that we can't control,
Mhm.
right? And the sun is hot, water's wet, and life is unpredictable. We just don't know what's going to happen, right? So there has to be some level of surrender that occurs for us to really be truly at peace with ourselves and the life that we're living. But yeah, I think that whole self-efficacy piece is it rolls into that quite nicely, because what we want to serve is our worth. And if our worth is based on the clothes we wear, or the way we look, or how much money is in our bank account, or how attractive our partner is, or whatever it might be, when those things change, and ultimately they will,
Mhm.
then does our worth change? Rather than saying, my worth is based on my inherent worth as a human being and the love that I have for myself, which actually doesn't change, or it doesn't have to change,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it changes if you base it on those external things that change throughout the world, but it doesn't if it's just a reflection of you.
I've been reading a lot about equity in grading and equity in assessment, and what your response is with that self-efficacy piece and that value and that self-worth, um, that reflection and that relationship between teacher and student, and even removing that barrier, and we're just humans learning together.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of helps us shift our mindsets in which ways we can act as the adult in the room to promote that self-efficacy for our students, but also show them the humanity that we're people too,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to talk about it, and we're going to try it, and we're going to keep
It's a wonderful
improving.
process, right? Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think and if we can just grow to accept that, and even, as crazy as it sounds, love that,
Mhm.
right? Then where would we be? Right? And if we were so focused on the beauty of the mistake rather than the error within it,
Mhm.
right? And the difference is, when we're talking about it here, it's very subtle, but ultimately it's quite profound. Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to mastery, because I think it's a term that can be misinterpreted in what we mean here. So the question is, how does emphasizing mastery in the learning process affect students' motivation and engagement in their education? And I really want to define mastery here as in not there's a quote that I read recently: formality is not validity. So when something is formalized in assessment, like we talk about, the exam has to be hidden from students. We
Mm-hmm.
can't share these answers with them. They can't take it home to review. Increasing that formality is not mastery. Mastery is truly practice,
Mm-hmm.
and emphasizing the practice and the work and those mistakes. So again, the question, how does emphasizing mastery in that sense impact the learning process for students?
Right. Well, I think motivation's an interesting one, right? And nobody's motivated to do something they're bad at, right? If we even take in our own hobbies and things we like to do on the weekend, typically we're pretty good at them, or at least we're getting better at them as we go. So I think it's all within the word, and I'm a big believer that the words we use and the language that we use make up the reality that we live, right? And I think understanding that the word mastery does encompass a lot of those trials and errors and difficulties, right, and the setbacks. I think that's a huge part of mastery, and that if we can get to the understanding where mastery isn't just 100%, or mastery doesn't mean you're the expert, that it's more along the lines of, because I think what happens is that we say mastery as the end point, right, rather than the process. And so if we could sort of shift our thinking to that, even the poor mark, or the dispute within the classroom, or the conflict at recess, or that is still a part of mastery, and that mastery can be seen at multiple levels and in different subject disciplines and different avenues of our life, that even some of the more difficult things that might happen throughout the day, and maybe somebody teases you and calls you a name, or maybe it's performing poorly on a standardized exam, right? Whatever it might be, that ultimately those difficulties and those trials are actually for our greatest good, right? And it's not woe is me, but a mentality of, okay, right, these are setbacks, so let's see what we're made of here, right? And having the ability to have some resiliency and some resolve is part of that, but also taking into account that life is the bigger picture, and ultimately it serves for your benefit rather than being a victim of it, right? And I think that's for me personally, that's a huge mentality and a huge shift in what has made a difference, in my own mental well-being, right? Because yeah, things are going to go wrong. You can't help that, right? But having the understanding that I don't know what's going to happen, but that's okay, right? And I'm human, and I have my difficulties and I have my imperfections, but the more that I'm able to love and embrace them is the greater degree to which I have my own self-mastery.
What? Are we still doing that? Ranking students. I recall the time when I was in elementary school, and one of the teachers that I had ordered us in terms of the seating arrangement, in terms of who was doing the best compared to who was not doing the best. And you can imagine, if you were 3 or 4 desks away from the front, well, maybe that motivated you to work harder or try better. But really, if you were that student near the back, that didn't do anything for your self-esteem. In fact, if anything, it lent stigma. And so when we think of rank order or ranking students, we have to be mindful of implicit and unconscious bias. So there are better ways to do that. That assessment really needs to be at an individualized level. Students really need to understand their progressions towards mastery, of where they are, where we hope they will get, and then what supports will we put along the way. If I just publicly post that, just like in university, student number and your grade, and it just showed you where you were in terms of top or bottom of the class. Well, if you were near the bottom, probably didn't feel too good about yourself. Whereas, if you're at the top, look at me. So there is stigma attached to that. And we want to be better than that in terms of the mental health and well-being of our students. And so let's stop doing that rank ordered piece. Explicitly, let's stop doing that. Bracket our biases and really focus on that individualized feedback to help students with their progressions, their demonstration of what they know and what they can do and what they understand. What do you think?
Yeah, I heard you bring up resilience, and that was in our next question. Can you speak a bit more to how this whole process does support resilience?
Yeah. And I think resilience is kind of a double-edged sword in some way, because I think it gets bandied around a lot. So I just be resilient. Come on, like life sucks. Be resilient, right? And I think out of context, it can do some harm. But where I see resiliency as being a real motivator is understanding the piece of life that is the greater picture, and that ultimately life is friction, right? Like there are tough spots. There's places where it feels like it's going to grind, but even the most difficult trials are ultimately going to serve you in your life, and that friction is like it's the it's like a gem or a diamond, right? It's under an immense amount of pressure as a piece of coal, and then finally when it sort of emerges from the earth, it is then grinded and polished, right? So life is the process of friction that polishes you into the gem that you are, right? And that without that bit of tension or feelings of uneasiness at times, and that those pieces where your sympathetic nervous system is firing, like, I got to do something about this, right? Those are the resolves in life that lead you to becoming ultimately a better person, a more well-rounded, a more whole person. And so if we can frame resiliency in that context, I think we do a great service to everyone, not just our students. So our teachers, our support staff, everyone within our buildings, and that who we interact with on a daily basis. I don't know what's going to happen, right? And I can worry and I can fixate and I can angst, or I can be okay with the uncertainty, right? And like for me, that's like I have to be okay with that, because if not, I would be this anxious ball of like I have no control, right? But control is a mechanism of the ego, right? Because it's that whole piece where at some point somebody told you weren't enough, right? And so along this line, now you're honestly just trying to become enough. And whether it's the acknowledgement of your parents or the love of your spouse or whatever it might be, right? We continually find ourselves on this journey of not being enough, right? When the real issue is that you believe that you're not enough, because as humans, like we have this lens of inadequacy and scarcity. And unfortunately, it's like that's like the program model that we get when we're like, that's what we download as human beings, right? And we're these, I believe that we're these spiritual beings in a very physical existence. And so where does that land for you, right? And I mean, I have my stories and a lot of things that hit home for me. But where does that sit for you, I guess?
I think for me, with the learning that I've done in this role, like assessment and reporting,
Yeah.
And all the books that I'm reading, and a lot of the books talk about equity and culturally responsive practice. And I look back at the things that I did as a teacher in assessment and reporting. Like
Right.
I was looking back at my course outlines for junior high from 2018. And right in there, I wrote, you get deducted 5% if it's late.
Right.
Every day you get a 0 if it's not handed in. And just thinking back to that moment in time and who my students were who experienced that.
Right.
I actually had a student who didn't hand in his work, and I didn't consider what was going on in his life at
Right.
the time when that was happening. And now what I know and what I've read, I know how damaging a zero can be, or how damaging that practice of deduction of grades for just late
Right.
work
Yeah.
is to students. And it's truly not equitable, because just like we would ask for extensions in our jobs,
Mm-hmm.
we should afford that same
Yeah.
to
Absolutely.
our students. And I probably hurt him
Right.
in that policy.
And that's and I think the thing that we get to reconcile is that we have it's this whole understanding too of what's right and wrong, right? And that's a hard thing to let go of, right? And a lot of, like, sometimes when I'm in front of staff, I love using the example of, because we in our culture have a very clear view of what's right and wrong, but yet it changes a lot, right? And as we could probably tell, especially through cultural equity and diversity, as we sort of enter into this post-structural paradigm that is the 21st century. So yeah, I think you hit a lot of pieces there, where you're saying this whole idea is that for a long time, assessment was punitive, right? If you didn't do it, it was seen poorly on you. So we have this idea that school is for the idea and execution of curriculum, and if academics aren't here, that's a problem, right? So what's the problem? Well, you're the problem. You're the teacher, right? So okay, well, as the teacher, I'm going to make this this punitive move here to sort of prompt my students to make sure that they get everything done and handed in on time, which of course, as we know as teachers, makes life a lot easier. But just sort of back to the idea of right and wrong. The example I love to give to staffs is, what if somebody hits you, somebody rear ends you in traffic? Whose fault is that? Right? Whose fault is it? Everyone. Well, of course, it's the person who hit me. Well, why?
Because it's a policy.
Exactly, right? Because somebody wrote it down that it's like that's their fault, right? And so my response to that is that, didn't you put yourself there? Well, yeah, right. But okay, so did you get up at a certain time? Did you have breakfast, or maybe not, or walk the dog, or maybe not, and then leave the house at a certain time, or maybe not, right? And then get stuck at that one particular light, right? But ultimately, you were in control, but you perceived it to be that you weren't, because somebody hit you, and because a policy says that they're at fault. Therefore, now your response is probably to be very upset or angry, right? And so for that reason, it's like, well, you feel justified in your anger. Where I might assert that, what I would assert is that that's an opportunity for you to see where you don't necessarily have the freedom within your life that you could, right? Because this external influence, this very uncontrollable piece, has just landed in your life right now, and it has just thrown off your whole day, your week, your month, or whatever, and now you have to deal with this huge problem, right? And don't get me wrong, that's a pain in the butt. Right? But pain in the butts happen, right? So either you deal with them, or you can lament about them, right? And I think that once you're able to see past that whole, the whole blame game, that you access a level of freedom that was, previously unavailable to you, right? And, blame is like this pie, right? And it's like, I want you to eat it, but ultimately I'm just scarfing down, right? So it's a tough thing to reconcile at times, especially when we've been told that this is the way our world works and these are the rules by which we are defined, which is not unlike education, right? And so I think the real opportunity now is to bring this element of wellness, that life takes time, right? That it's not necessarily always defined by deadlines. And don't get me wrong, hey, deadlines help. They can get the job done too, right? But ultimately, that life is a huge learning process, and it doesn't necessarily stop when you leave this this section of time within a class, right? And that there's still lots of learning that happens before, during at recess or after school and on the weekends, right? So there's a whole element that I think of wellness that can be interwoven within schools, that can be easily accessible.
We were speaking to policy and how policy can be flexed at times, and that flexing so that we can allow for the humanity of what we do as educators to come through in our decision making and in our teaching practice.
Right. And I think, what we're hitting on here is just sort of being a responsive educator. And in whatever context it fits, the big thing for me personally, and something that I've found has been a huge impact as a consultant and especially as a teacher too, I should say, is that when I go into a classroom or a teacher asks me out to come observe or whatever it might be, the first thing I do is listen, right? And I think if we all had one superhero power that we could really flex as teachers, would be our ability to do just that, is to listen. So whether it's an extension for a deadline, or maybe it's a practice in grading an assessment, right? I think the biggest thing we can do is be responsive and to listen to what the concerns are, and then be able to make a judgment based on that, right? Rather than being very, very rigid. And don't get me wrong, policies, they serve a purpose, and they are, they're kind of the guideline and the answer to the question. But certainly being able to be flexible in our responses, but still maintain a standard of integrity, is still very important. And a lot of what we do as educators and as consultants is to try and be able to create a high standard of learning with a great deal of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sort of pairing those two is something that it's an ongoing process, and it's an exciting one for me,
Mm-hmm.
and one that I'm certainly passionate about.
And it doesn't happen by accident. It takes a lot of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of planning.
Yeah.
And discussion with other colleagues, because we know that we have implicit biases, and if we're not engaging in conversation with other educators or even people outside of our field, we're not always seeing those biases
Right.
as we're moving in this.
Yeah, they're inherent, right? And it's really what they are is just their blind spots, right? And you don't know you don't even know they're there
Mm-hmm.
until somebody makes you aware of them, right? And certainly, even when you go to like, let's say a new school, right? There are so many things that are hidden that you don't know until you actually get into the building and start working with students, that you just don't know. They're completely hidden from you. But again, I believe a lot in the fact that life is this giant game of transcending those inherent biases and those hidden, those blind spots that exist within our life, so that we can really truly start to shape and define and live our lives with a lot of love and integrity within that love.
A lot of the equity efforts and grading reform texts speak about bringing students into that.
Did you see that?
Yeah, it fell over.
It's clearly speaking to us.
Into bringing conversation into the classroom, and that release of control, and that students are having more voice and choice in the
Mm-hmm.
classroom. And one strategy that I've learned over time or method of teaching that I've learned over time that really allows this is inquiry-based teaching and learning. And I think it gets a bad rap because sometimes we think it's like, oh, free for all,
Right.
students just go for it. But when you read about inquiry-based teaching and learning, it's actually that whole process of having students ask questions and allowing them to ask these questions so that we can guide learning that's meaningful to them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. And it's kind of ironic. This is this book, The Field, was knocked over because this book is specifically about all of or a lot of outlying research, scientific research, and clinical studies that are out there that aren't necessarily the most mainstream pieces that are put together quite well, actually, by Lynn McTaggart. She's a journalist. But she's put together this sort of conglomerate of all of these sort of outlying scientific studies about things that aren't necessarily first understood or accepted by kind of the Newtonian physics that we know it today. So it's interesting that you kind of bring up that point about inquiry-based learning, because a lot of the studies that are done in here are inquiry, but they're inquiry on another level that we might not necessarily see as necessarily tangible, right? I'll give you one example. It's a really cool experiment. Is what they did was essentially they took participants and they drew some blood from them, right? And I said, this is your blood, right? And what they did is then they mixed it with salt, right? So they just sort of increased the level of a saline solution that was poured into it and just monitored at what level did the blood cells burst or die, right? And then they just sort of had that as their benchmark. And then they asked the individual who they took the blood from was to concentrate on the blood as they increased the salinity of it. And they said, try to keep your blood cells intact for as long as you can. And sure enough, in every study that happened, the blood cells were actually able to take larger levels of salinity when somebody was concentrating on it, right? Which to me speaks to a lot of the power of our thoughts and our prayers and our actions, right? So yeah, it's a fascinating book. I would just highly recommend it, but it's interesting that you bring it up in the process of inquiry, right? Because that started with just an inquiry, like I wonder if, or what would happen if, right? The context is there, the environment is there, but we're sort of setting up the avenue of give it your best creative thought and make it a creative thought that's authentic to you, because that's what you're going to find genuinely interesting. And from that genuine interest, you can just go a whole lot further with whatever it is you're deciding to study than you could had it just been this prescribed level of, hey, take this on, right? And see how it goes, right? You know, and I think that too brings in a level of efficacy as well, right? Because as an individual, a student, a teacher, you're going to be much more involved and much more engaged if you feel the ownership, right? And I'm sure we can all relate to that on some level.
I'm hearing mindset matters in that response. And John Hattie, in his meta-analysis of 250, I don't remember the exact number.
Just a lot of papers, a lot of academic research, right?
The research. In the top two is teacher collective efficacy. So that belief that we can, the belief that we can impact student learning is very effective. So do you have anything to share with us on mindset?
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, we could probably spend a whole other podcast just I think we've touched on some pieces and some understanding, but certainly the whole idea is that you know, like it's the idea of reaching your potential or living up to your potential, which is actually impossible, right? No one, have you ever met anyone who's been like, yes, I am at my potential, right? Like I am here, I'm at the top of the mountain. No, it's a never-ending mountain if we think of it that way. But what we do become as we hit setbacks, as we go through difficulties, as we face life, is a more evolved version of ourselves. And I think for me, that's been a powerful understanding, is that no matter what's happening, I am just continually evolving and refining, who I am as a person. And that to me is a great deal of self-love. And through that process, I've been able to do a lot of things that I might not have, envisioned or even dreamed maybe 5-10 years ago, including, sitting here with you right now. Right. So it's the understanding that, yes, resiliency is important, and having kind of a growth mindset is important, but understanding the value and the worth that you have, and really just digging in and loving some of those things, even if they are our biggest fears and insecurities, right? Because as humans, we make mistakes, and I think we just need, as people, I think we need more tools to connect ourselves to ourselves, rather than connecting ourselves to our insecurities and our fears, which I feel is quite often the bait of social media, because it digs into the idea that we're not enough, and this is what it should be if you're enough, right? And so for me, as an educator, as a consultant, I like seeing things that help people connect with themselves rather than connect with what they're not.
So we're going to end on maybe some practical paths for schools. A new curriculum is one of them. We've heard that some of those
shocker
those outcomes in Pew are pushing into this realm and helping scaffold that for us as teachers.
Yeah. So I mean, if I've worked on a lot of curriculum crates, that's I feel that's an out of place plug from where we've been working, but certainly in terms of, I think the practical essence here is start with you, right? Start with you, whether it's, picking up something that you're passionate about or you've been passionate about in the past, right? But, or maybe it's, cleaning out that laundry room of things, right? That you needed to take care of, or maybe it's gardening, or whatever it could be, sports, right? Like, what is that thing that you carve out for you and that helps you determine and really set the self-worth button to that inherent piece rather than the external world, right? I think there is no greater service that you can do for your students than being well in your own capacities, right? And I don't think anybody, I don't think you can teach wellness or know wellness if you're not well or feeling well yourself. So in terms of the practical pieces, figure out what you love. What do you want to do? Do you want to be active? Maybe it's read a book, listen to a podcast like this, meditate or pray, or however it is, go to church, right? Like, whatever it is that sets into you a feeling of, I'm okay with life and I'm okay with me, then dig into that and really feel it out. So I think if there's one thing that I could offer the audience, that would be it.
Start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think once that happens, is that once you have the idea to you, right, rather than going out and chasing things and fixing circumstances and trying to perfect life itself, instead life comes to you, right? And that is a profoundly different experience than chasing insecurity, inadequacy, and fear, right? Rather than saying, what do I have to do to be part of the group? Well, I'm already part of the group, so I can wait for the group to come to me too, right? And that I think is a huge paradigm shift.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to keep reflecting on that one.
Yeah, well, and I've reflected on it for a long time, so I could speak to it. COVID did a lot of things to me too, right? So yeah, and certainly, like, I would kind of highlight some of these ones. We've talked about the field. The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk, he did a great job in highlighting the distinction and understanding that the things that happen that we hold on to within our minds actually have a physical and real impact on our bodies, right? And it's not the separation of mind body, but the pieces that they are interwoven and work together, right? And that actually it's kind of a Hindu piece here that brings in the understanding that all disease is just the absence of ease, right? And that if something comes into our system and where we continually bring into our system, whether it's physical or emotional, right? And first we start with accumulation and then we get to aggravation, and then it's sort of like this manifestation within us. So this book actually takes kind of a very scientific, a very DSM approach, and sort of highlights where the traumas of life are hidden and stored within our bodies themselves. So very interesting read. And then one of my personal, I would say, my teachers in Krishnamurti, very good philosophical piece on understanding that a lot of the times we are just the byproduct of our subconscious wiring, and that those subconscious actions quite often take place without us even knowing it, right?
Mhm.
And it's the understanding that, like, why do things in life always happen to me like this, right? The idea of, well, I'm going to try and fix my life. But the truth of the matter is that you don't get the life you want by trying to fix the one you don't want,
Mhm.
right? And again, that's another, when I read that, I was like, I don't understand this, right?
Mhm.
Because as humans, we're chasing all the time, right? We're trying to fix things, right? When we looked at that student in kindergarten in grade 1, they're saying, well, there's nothing wrong with me,
Mhm.
right? And that's the truth about it. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with me,
Mhm.
right? My problem is that I see a problem.
Yeah.
More often than not.
Yeah. So we'll have all 3 of these book titles in the description if any of our listeners want to go check them out. And before we end off, this is a question that I'm looking at asking all of our guests is, and it's a big one, so answer it how you will. What is a dream you have for education?
Well, and I think we touched a lot on that. And I think my dream for education is that, well, first, that we get an understanding what wellness is, right? And we have kind of a unified um, piece of that. And there are different, there's wellness, defined in kind of, the scholastic piece in 2 different camps. One being sort of the idea that, it makes you feel good,
Mhm.
right? And then the other camp being sort of like based on your morals, your identity, and your goals, that's the way you're living your life, right? And to the merits of both, I think there's room for a lot of us to grow in our own understanding of wellness for ourselves. So what I would love to see for education is that wellness becomes a ubiquitous part of our day, and that the curriculum standards that exist they're mapped within wellness rather than opposed to, or wellness is on the side of. So that would be my, I think, big dream and big goal. Wellness not just for students, but for teachers and for everybody else in the building, our support staff, our custodians, our admin assistants, right? Like
Mhm.
everyone who sets foot in the building, even our parents, right? So yeah, that would be my big goal and big dream and
Mhm.
big love.
Wellness as an umbrella to everything.
Yeah, and it's just something. When was the last time you felt vitality,
Mhm.
right? And because I think a lot of the times we throw around the word health, right? And in terms of our physiology, I think health is just sort of the general maintenance of what's going on within our body, where I think what we should be striving for is, being able to seize and embrace the vitality that we all have, no matter what age we're at.
Well, thanks for sharing today, Britt. I'm sure our listeners, and I know for myself, I'm walking away with so many different thinking points and reflection pieces. So, thanks for being on.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, it's been great, and hopefully we'll get to do it again sometime.
For sure.
Excellent.
We're now at the end of the episode. Before we sign off, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Britt Barron for talking to us about wellness and well-being, and providing us many different ways we can reflect on how we take care of ourselves in education. Thank you to both Nicole Lafreniere and Tim Cusack for their segments. And last but not least, to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in to our episodes here on The Learning Curve. A reminder, we're releasing episodes bi-weekly, with each episode featuring different voices and perspectives. Please like and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with each release. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, our YouTube channel at ECSD Learning, and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. All 3 links are in the episode description. Lastly, we want to hear from you, both on Spotify and on Instagram. Please share with us your classroom experiences with assessment or anything that you'd like us to discuss on this podcast. That's our time. See you next week on The Learning Curve.